There's a hospital room where time stopped 7 years ago. A child lies in a bed surrounded by equipment that should be keeping her alive, but instead keeps her suspended between death and something far worse. Her body is burned beyond recognition, skin charred and melted, nerve endings exposed to air that turns every breath into agony. She should have died in the fire. Every doctor who examines her charts says the same thing. Medically, biologically, this child cannot be alive. The pain alone should have shut down her organs. The infection should have killed her. The sheer trauma to her system should have let her slip away. But Alessa Gillespie doesn't die. She can't die, because dying would mean release, and release is exactly what her mother cannot allow. So Alessa burns in a hospital bed for 7 years, and her screaming doesn't stay contained to that room. It leaks out, it spreads, it transforms an entire town into a landscape of rust and blood and monsters that hunt through fog. Silent Hill doesn't just become haunted, it becomes Alessa. Every street corner manifests her fear. Every darkened corridor reflects her rage. Every creature stalking through the mist is her trauma given teeth and claws. And at the center of it all is a 7-year-old girl whose mental anguish became so profound, so catastrophic, that reality itself couldn't contain it. Tonight we're examining Alessa Gillespie through the lens of clinical psychology, diagnosing every mental disorder this child exhibits, understanding how trauma this severe rewires a developing brain, and recognizing that what happened to her isn't supernatural horror made psychological, but psychological horror made supernatural. Before you enjoy this deep dive into one of horror gaming's most tragic figures, hit that like button to help other fans discover this analysis, and let me know down in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing our late night community check in from across the globe. Now get comfortable, turn down those lights, and let's begin. To understand Alessa's mental state, we need to start with what happened to her body, because psychological trauma and physical trauma don't exist in separate categories when you're 7 years old and your mother sets you on fire. The ritual that Dahlia Gillespie performed wasn't a quick death. It wasn't even meant to be death at all. Dahlia needed Alessa alive to birth the god the Order worshipped, so the fire had to damage her enough to break her resistance, but not enough to kill her. This is calculated torture disguised as religious ceremony, and the psychological implications are staggering. When a child experiences severe physical trauma, especially trauma inflicted by a parent, the brain enters a state of existential crisis. The person who should protect you is the person destroying you. The home that should represent safety becomes the site of your annihilation. For Alessa, there was no safe person, no safe place, no psychological refuge. Her mother orchestrated her burning. The cult members participated. The town knew and did nothing. When Travis Grady pulled her from the flames, he was the only person in her entire life who acted to save her rather than exploit her, and even that moment of rescue couldn't undo the fundamental shattering of her worldview. The physical pain Alessa experienced would have been beyond any scale we use to measure suffering. Fourth-degree burns destroy skin, fat, muscle, and bone. They expose nerve endings completely, turning every molecule of air into sandpaper against raw tissue. The human body releases endorphins during extreme trauma to dull pain, but those systems have limits. When pain exceeds the body's capacity to manage it, the mind fractures. It has to. Consciousness cannot remain integrated while experiencing agony of that magnitude, so the mind splits, dissociates, creates distance between the part that's experiencing the pain and the part that's trying to maintain some version of self. Alessa's dissociation wasn't a coping mechanism she could control. It was an involuntary neurological response to unbearable circumstances, a survival strategy her brain implemented without her conscious input. This is how dissociative disorders develop in children exposed to prolonged, inescapable trauma. The mind fragments because remaining whole means experiencing everything, and experiencing everything means psychological death. Better to split into pieces that can each hold different aspects of the trauma than to remain unified and be destroyed completely. Alessa's primary diagnosis would be complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that develops from prolonged, repeated trauma, especially trauma that occurs during childhood and involves betrayal by caregivers. Standard PTSD develops from single incidents or time-limited traumatic experiences, a car accident, a natural disaster, a single assault. Complex PTSD develops from chronic trauma that the victim cannot escape, and it creates a fundamentally different psychological profile. The diagnostic criteria for complex PTSD include all the symptoms of standard PTSD: intrusive memories, hypervigilance, avoidance of trauma reminders, negative alterations in mood and cognition, plus additional features: severe difficulties in emotional regulation, profoundly negative self-concept, and pervasive problems with relationships. Let's examine how Alessa exhibits each of these. Intrusive memories and complex PTSD aren't just flashbacks. They're a constant reliving of trauma that blurs the boundary between past and present. For Alessa, lying in that hospital bed for 7 years, there was no distraction from her memories, no school to attend, no friends to visit, no activities to occupy her mind, just endless hours alone with the memory of burning, the sensation of her skin melting, the sight of her mother's face as Dahlia watched her daughter immolated for a god that may not even exist. These memories didn't intrude occasionally. They were her entire existence. The hospital room became a prison where the only thing to think about was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. The hypervigilance in Alessa's case manifested as supernatural awareness. Her psychic abilities, which existed before the fire, amplified exponentially after the trauma. She could sense people's thoughts, perceive their intentions, detect threats before they materialized. This isn't just plot convenience. It's a literalization of the hypervigilance that trauma creates. Children with complex PTSD develop extraordinary sensitivity to environmental cues because their survival depended on predicting danger. They learn to read micro-expressions, detect subtle shifts in tone, monitor everyone around them for signs of impending harm. Alessa's psychic abilities took this natural trauma response and amplified it to supernatural levels, making her hypervigilance actually omniscient. The negative self-concept in complex PTSD is particularly devastating in children. Adults who develop PTSD had years to form a stable sense of self before trauma disrupted it. Children who experience severe trauma during critical developmental periods never get the chance to form a healthy self-concept. Instead, they build their identity around the trauma. They come to believe they deserved what happened to them, that they're fundamentally damaged, that something about them invited the abuse. Alessa experienced this on multiple levels. First, she was bullied relentlessly at school before the fire. The other children tormented her for being different, for having psychic abilities that frightened them, for being withdrawn and strange. Children are extraordinarily cruel to peers who don't conform, and that cruelty creates deep wounds in the target's self-image. Alessa would have internalized the message that she was wrong somehow, that her very existence was problematic, that if only she were normal, she wouldn't be suffering. Second, her mother explicitly framed the ritual as Alessa's purpose, her destiny. Dahlia didn't present the burning as punishment, but as fulfillment, telling Alessa that birthing God was what she was meant to do, that her suffering served a higher purpose. This creates profound cognitive dissonance in a child. If your mother says your agony has meaning, if authority figures tell you this is what you're supposed to do, how do you reject that narrative? Children are psychologically wired to trust parents, to internalize parental messages as truth. When the parental message is that your torture is justified, the child incorporates that belief into their core identity. Third, the sheer duration of her suffering reinforced the belief that this was her natural state. 7 years is an eternity when you're a child. If you burn for 7 years, burning becomes your identity. You're not a girl who was burned. You are burning. The pain becomes so fundamental to your existence that imagining yourself without it becomes impossible. This is how chronic pain rewires identity, transforming a temporary condition into a permanent sense of self. The relationship difficulties in complex PTSD stem from betrayal trauma. When the people who should protect you instead harm you, trust becomes impossible. Alessa had no one. Her mother orchestrated her immolation. The cult participated willingly. The town knew and allowed it to happen. Even her father, if he was ever present, didn't stop it. The only person who helped her was Travis Grady, a stranger passing through town, and even his rescue couldn't undo the fundamental lesson Alessa had learned. People are dangerous, adults will hurt you, and there is no safety anywhere. This total absence of safe attachment figures creates what psychologists call disorganized attachment, the most severe attachment disturbance. Children with disorganized attachment want closeness but fear it simultaneously. They approach caregivers but then freeze or display contradictory behaviors because their instinct to seek comfort conflicts with their learned knowledge that caregivers cause harm. In Alessa's case, this manifested in her splitting her soul. She created Cheryl as a separate being, a part of herself that could exist outside the suffering, that could potentially find the safety and love she'd never experienced. But she also kept Cheryl separate, never fully integrating with her, because even splitting herself in half was safer than remaining whole and vulnerable. Until you realize that everything Alessa did after the fire, the creation of the other world, the manifestation of monsters, the transformation of Silent Hill into a nightmare landscape, wasn't revenge or anger in any simple sense. It was the externalization of internal states she had no other way to express. Children don't have the cognitive sophistication or vocabulary to process trauma through language. They can't sit in therapy and articulate their feelings. They process trauma through play, through symbolic expression, through externalizing what they can't verbalize. Alessa's psychic power gave her the ability to externalize on a scale no human child should possess, transforming her internal landscape of pain into a literal, external landscape that everyone entering Silent Hill had to navigate. The splitting of Alessa's soul into Alessa and Cheryl represents dissociative identity disorder in its most literal form. Dissociative identity disorder develops when severe trauma during early childhood causes the personality to fragment into distinct identity states as a survival mechanism. It's not a dramatic split personality like movies portray. It's a failure of integration, where different aspects of self that should consolidate into a unified identity instead remain separate and distinct. In typical development, children experience different ego states: the playful self, the frightened self, the angry self, but these states gradually integrate into a cohesive personality. By age 7 or 8, most children have developed a relatively stable sense of being one continuous person, across different situations and emotional states. Trauma disrupts this integration process. When a child experiences overwhelming abuse, especially abuse that occurs repeatedly and involves different emotional states, the mind keeps those states separate as a protective mechanism. The part that's being hurt stays separate from the part that plays or the part that seeks love, because integrating them would mean the entire self is contaminated by the trauma. Alessa's creation of Cheryl fits this pattern precisely. Cheryl embodies the part of Alessa that wasn't burned, that didn't suffer, that could potentially experience normal childhood. When Dahlia began the ritual and Alessa felt the flames starting, her mind performed an emergency dissociation so profound it became supernatural. She literally split her soul, sending the innocent, undamaged part of herself away, while keeping the traumatized, burning part contained in her body. This wasn't a conscious choice. It was a reflexive psychological survival mechanism amplified by psychic ability. The fact that Cheryl has no memory of being Alessa, that she grows up believing she's a separate person named Cheryl Mason raised by Harry, demonstrates the amnestic barriers between dissociated identities. In DID, different alters often don't share memories or awareness. They experience themselves as completely separate individuals, and in some cases they genuinely are. Different ages, different genders, different personalities shaped by different functions. Cheryl functions as Alessa's innocent child alter, the part that holds the possibility of normalcy and love, while Alessa remains the trauma holder, the part that contains all the suffering. The game's resolution, Cheryl and Alessa reuniting, represents either integration or death, depending on which ending you receive. Integration in dissociative identity disorder therapy is controversial. Some clinicians believe the goal should be creating cooperation between alters rather than forcing them to merge, recognizing that the fragmentation serves a purpose and that each alter has value. But in Alessa's case, remaining split meant remaining trapped. She couldn't birth the God while fragmented, and she couldn't die while fragmented. The reunion forces her to become whole again, and wholeness for someone this damaged means either complete psychological collapse or transcendence through death. The bad ending, where the God is born, represents failed integration. The traumatized parts of Alessa and the innocent parts merge, but instead of creating a healed whole, they create something monstrous because the trauma is too overwhelming to integrate successfully. The good ending, where Alessa gives Harry the baby that represents her reborn self and then dies, represents successful integration through transformation. She becomes whole long enough to create something new, something that carries her essence but isn't contaminated by her suffering, and then she allows herself to finally die. This is psychologically sophisticated storytelling about dissociation. Most media treats multiple personalities as dramatic switches or as a gimmick. Silent Hill treats dissociation as a desperate survival strategy that creates its own problems, that keeps you alive but also keeps you fragmented, and that requires extraordinary courage to undo. One aspect of Alessa's psychology that's often overlooked is her persistent need for her mother despite everything Dahlia did to her. Throughout Silent Hill 1, references suggest Alessa still wanted Dahlia's love, still hoped on some level that her mother might choose her over the cult, still couldn't fully reject the person who should have been her primary attachment figure. This demonstrates the profound power of attachment needs in children and how they persist even in the face of catastrophic parental failure. Attachment theory tells us that children are biologically wired to seek proximity to caregivers, especially during distress. This drive is so fundamental that it continues even when caregivers are the source of the distress. Studies of abused children show they often cling to their abusers, seeking comfort from the very people causing them harm. This isn't because the children are stupid or masochistic. It's because the attachment system is so powerful it overrides the threat detection system. The child's brain essentially reasons, this person is hurting me, but they're also my only possible source of safety, so I must stay close to them and try to elicit caregiving. Alessa experienced this paradox in its most extreme form. Dahlia was her only parent, her only possible source of maternal love, even as Dahlia orchestrated her burning, even as Dahlia visited her hospital room, not to comfort but to ensure she was suffering appropriately, even as Dahlia's every action demonstrated that she valued her cult's beliefs more than her daughter's life. Alessa couldn't fully sever the attachment bond. Children cannot psychologically afford to believe their parents don't love them. That knowledge is too devastating to integrate during childhood. So instead, children in abusive situations often blame themselves, reasoning that if they were better or different, the parent would love them properly. We see hints of this in how Alessa manifests her trauma. The other world she creates isn't designed to harm Dahlia. When Dahlia appears in the game, she's not attacked by monsters, not trapped in burning rooms, not subjected to the horrors that other people experience. Alessa's rage toward the cult members, toward the children who bullied her, toward the town that allowed her suffering, all of that manifests as concrete threats. But her feelings toward her mother are more complicated, more conflicted, and so Dahlia moves through Silent Hill relatively unscathed until the very end. This reflects a psychological reality about child abuse. The child almost always loves the abusive parent while simultaneously fearing them. The love doesn't erase the fear, and the fear doesn't erase the love. Both exist simultaneously, creating profound internal conflict. Attachment disordered children often display this contradiction behaviorally. They might be violent toward their abusive parent one moment and desperately seeking their affection the next. They want the parent to be who the parent should be, and they rage at the parent for failing, and both responses come from the same source, the fundamental need for parental love that every child carries. The film adaptation made this dynamic more explicit, showing young Alessa being bullied and Dahlia's inadequate response, then showing the cult's betrayal and Alessa's realization that her mother chose the cult over her. The moment where Alessa accepts her dark half's offer of revenge is the moment she gives up hope of maternal love, the moment she accepts that Dahlia will never be the mother she needs. This acceptance allows her rage to become active rather than passive, transforming from suffering into vengeance. But even in vengeance, there's the shadow of that need. If she didn't care about Dahlia's love, Dahlia's betrayal wouldn't hurt enough to motivate such catastrophic revenge. From a diagnostic standpoint, Alessa likely exhibits reactive attachment disorder, a condition that develops when children don't form healthy attachments to caregivers during critical developmental periods. RAD presents as either inhibited type, where the child doesn't seek comfort and doesn't respond to it when offered, or disinhibited type, where the child is inappropriately familiar with strangers and doesn't show appropriate caution. Alessa would fall into the inhibited category. She withdraws from people, doesn't seek connection, remains isolated in her suffering. The splitting of her soul can be understood partly as an extreme manifestation of this attachment failure. If you can't get love from the actual people in your life, you create a version of yourself who might be capable of receiving it somewhere else. For 7 years, Alessa lies in a hospital bed, unable to move, unable to speak, unresponsive to external stimuli except presumably to experience the ongoing pain of her wounds. While her physical condition explains part of this immobility, the psychological component suggests severe depression with catatonic features. Catatonia is a syndrome characterized by marked psychomotor disturbance, which can include immobility, mutism, negativism, and staring. It occurs in various psychiatric conditions but is particularly associated with severe depression. The DSM describes catatonia as stupor, no psychomotor activity, and no active relating to environment, or catalepsy, passive induction of a posture held against gravity, or waxy flexibility, slight, and even resistance to positioning by examiner, or mutism, no or very little verbal response. Alessa exhibits several of these. Her immobility goes beyond what her burns would require. She doesn't speak, doesn't move, doesn't respond to attempts at interaction. This complete withdrawal represents a severe catatonic state. Catatonia often develops as a response to overwhelming psychological distress. When the mind can no longer process what's happening, when every thought leads to unbearable emotional pain, shutting down becomes the only tolerable option. The catatonic person essentially closes themselves off from all stimulation, internal and external, as a protective measure. For Alessa, lying in agony with no hope of recovery, no comfort from caregivers, no possibility of escape, catatonia would be a merciful alternative to full consciousness. But here's where Alessa's case becomes unique. Her catatonia is only physical. Her mind remains hyperactive, and because of her psychic abilities, that mental activity manifests externally as the other world. This creates a paradox where she appears completely shut down on the outside while being profoundly active on the inside. It's as though her consciousness, unable to remain in her damaged body, projected itself outward into the town itself. Silent Hill becomes the body she can move through, the voice she can speak with, the agency she can't exercise physically. This externalization serves a psychological function similar to what catatonia serves. It's a way of existing when existing in your actual circumstances is intolerable. Alessa can't interact with the physical world in any meaningful way. Her body is a prison of pain. But through her psychic projection, she can act, can create, can impose her will on reality. The other world is her mobility, her voice, her resistance to the helplessness her physical condition imposes. The depressive component of Alessa's condition is evident in the nature of what she creates. The other world isn't just scary, it's saturated with hopelessness, decay, and futility. The rust that covers every surface represents not just physical deterioration, but emotional erosion, the slow grinding down of all vitality and possibility. The blood that seeps through walls and floors represents not just violence, but the persistence of wounds that never heal. The monsters that patrol the darkness represent not just threats, but the conviction that suffering is inevitable, that danger is everywhere, that safety is impossible. This thematic consistency points to a depressive worldview where everything is filtered through the lens of despair. When depressed individuals create art or describe their experience, certain themes recur: decay, emptiness, futility, the impossibility of genuine connection, the persistence of pain. Alessa's Otherworld is a depressive episode made environmental, a three-dimensional manifestation of what it feels like to experience severe depression, trapped in a landscape where everything is decaying, where beauty is corrupted, where any attempt to move forward leads only to more rust and blood and darkness. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from trauma in childhood, a grief not for something lost, but for something that never had the chance to exist. Alessa never got to be a normal child. Her psychic abilities set her apart from birth, making normal peer relationships impossible. Her mother's exploitation meant her home life was shaped by manipulation rather than nurturing. The bullying at school meant education became torment, and then the fire destroyed any possibility of recovering a normal trajectory. Prolonged grief disorder, previously called complicated grief, is diagnosed when grief persists with high intensity beyond the expected cultural and social norms, interfering with functioning and quality of life. It's typically discussed in the context of losing a loved one, but psychological literature recognizes that people can experience intense grief for other kinds of losses: loss of innocence, loss of childhood, loss of the future they imagined. Alessa's case represents grief for the self she never got to become. Children have an intuitive understanding of what childhood should be. They see other children playing, forming friendships, being loved by parents, experiencing safety and exploration and gradual development. When a child's actual experience deviates dramatically from this template, they experience grief for the childhood they're not having. This grief often can't be expressed directly because children lack the language and conceptual framework to articulate it. Instead, it manifests as anger, withdrawal, or acting out. For Alessa, this grief was compounded by her awareness of other children's lives. She could sense their thoughts, perceive their experiences, and that psychic access made her painfully aware of exactly what she was missing. She knew what it felt like to have a mother who protected rather than exploited. She knew what it felt like to have friends rather than bullies. She knew what normal felt like, and that knowledge made her own abnormality that much more painful. The creation of Cheryl can be understood partly as an attempt to give herself the childhood she never had. By splitting off an innocent part of herself and sending it away, she gave that part a chance at normalcy: a loving father, a life outside Silent Hill, freedom from psychic abilities, and cult exploitation. This is sophisticated psychological reasoning for a 7-year-old, suggesting that Alessa's intelligence and awareness were far beyond her chronological age, likely a result of trauma forcing premature psychological development. Trauma forces children to grow up too fast. They have to understand adult realities: betrayal, deliberate cruelty, the failure of systems meant to protect them, long before they're developmentally ready. This creates what's called adult children, kids who seem eerily mature, who speak with unexpected sophistication, who understand complex interpersonal dynamics. But this premature maturity comes at a cost. They skip the developmental stages that build healthy personality structure, jumping straight from childhood to a kind of pseudo-adulthood that's actually just a trauma response masquerading as maturity. Alessa exhibits this in how she orchestrates her plan, creating Cheryl, preventing the god's birth by remaining fragmented, spreading her nightmare across the entire town. These are sophisticated strategic decisions, not impulsive reactions. She's thinking several steps ahead, understanding consequences, manipulating outcomes. This level of planning requires executive function and abstract reasoning that most 7-year-olds haven't developed yet. But trauma accelerated her development in specific domains while arresting it in others, creating someone who's simultaneously a terrified child and a strategic mastermind. The grief also manifests in the specific nature of the monsters she creates. Many of them are child-sized or childlike, twisted versions of children that attack rather than play. The gray children that appear throughout Silent Hill 1 are school-aged kids transformed into threats, their small knives and hesitant movements suggesting children playing at violence rather than actual predators. They represent Alessa's peers, the classmates who bullied her, but they also represent her grief about childhood itself. These should be playmates, but in her experience, children are sources of pain. This transformation of children into monsters demonstrates how trauma corrupts even the concept of innocence. Alessa can't perceive children as innocent because children weren't innocent to her. They were cruel, exclusionary, violent. Her trauma has rewritten her understanding of what childhood means, replacing the cultural ideal of childhood innocence with the lived reality of childhood cruelty. And because Silent Hill manifests her internal world, children become monstrous in her version of reality. The grief Alessa carries is unresolvable because you can't mourn your way back to a childhood that never happened. You can grieve a lost loved one and eventually find some acceptance. But how do you grieve for the person you never got to become? How do you find closure about experiences you never got to have? This type of grief often persists throughout life because there's no natural endpoint, no ritual that brings resolution, no gradual acceptance that brings peace. The absence remains an absence forever. While much of what Alessa experiences is presented as genuinely supernatural within the game's universe, her psychic powers are real, the other world is real. The manifestation of her trauma into physical form is real. From a clinical perspective, we must also consider whether prolonged, extreme physical pain could induce psychotic symptoms that Alessa might interpret as supernatural abilities. Psychosis is defined as a loss of contact with reality, characterized by hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, or grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. It can occur in schizophrenia spectrum disorders, but it can also occur secondary to medical conditions including severe pain, sensory deprivation, isolation, and extreme stress. Alessa's situation combined all of these factors. She experienced pain beyond any normal threshold, sensory deprivation from being confined to a hospital bed, extreme social isolation with no comforting human contact, and psychological stress that would break most adults, let alone a child. There's a documented phenomenon called pain-related psychosis, where individuals experiencing chronic severe pain develop psychotic symptoms. The proposed mechanism is that unrelenting pain creates such extreme neurological stress that neurotransmitter systems dysregulate, leading to perceptual disturbances and delusional thinking. Patients with pain-induced psychosis might hallucinate, develop paranoid beliefs, or experience delusional perceptions about their bodies or circumstances. If we apply this framework to Alessa, we might understand her psychic abilities as psychotic symptoms emerging from trauma and pain. The ability to read minds could be hypervigilance and pattern recognition so acute it becomes delusional. She's so attuned to subtle behavioral cues that she believes she's reading thoughts when she's actually making extraordinarily accurate inferences. The other world could be a shared psychotic disorder, where her intense beliefs and terror are so powerful they influence the perceptions of others who enter the town. The monsters could be hallucinations that her psychic suggestion makes others perceive as well. This naturalistic interpretation doesn't work perfectly with the game's internal logic, which clearly presents Alessa's abilities as genuinely supernatural. But from a clinical standpoint, it's worth considering because it demonstrates how extreme circumstances can produce experiences that feel indistinguishable from supernatural phenomena. People undergoing severe psychosis genuinely see, hear, and experience things that aren't there. The hallucinations aren't pretend. They have the same neurological reality as actual perceptions. If Alessa was hallucinating the other world due to pain-induced psychosis, it would feel completely real to her, and her conviction might be so powerful it influences others. The isolation component is particularly relevant. Studies on sensory deprivation show that humans deprived of stimulation and social contact begin experiencing hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive disorganization remarkably quickly, sometimes within hours. Alessa spent 7 years with minimal human contact, no activities, no stimulation beyond her own thoughts, and the pain of her wounds. This level of deprivation would absolutely produce psychotic symptoms in anyone, let alone a developing child. The content of psychotic symptoms is often influenced by the person's cultural background, fears, and preoccupations. If Alessa was raised in a cult environment where she was taught about gods, rituals, and supernatural power, her psychotic symptoms would likely incorporate those themes. She might experience delusions about birthing a god because that's the framework Dahlia provided. She might hallucinate demonic creatures because that's consistent with the cult's worldview. Her psychosis would be shaped by the narrative she was given about her purpose and nature. There's also the question of whether others actually perceive what Alessa creates or whether they're experiencing their own guilt-based hallucinations that merely seem to overlap with hers. In Silent Hill 2, different characters perceive different manifestations based on their individual psychologies. What if Silent Hill 1 works the same way? What if Harry is experiencing his own psychotic break triggered by grief and stress, and the overlaps with Alessa's experience are coincidental or influenced by the town's environmental factors rather than direct psychic projection? This interpretation is admittedly speculative and contradicts the game's explicit supernatural elements, but it's worth considering because it demonstrates how profoundly trauma can alter perception and cognition. Whether Alessa's experiences are genuinely supernatural or are psychotic symptoms her mind created to survive, the psychological mechanisms are similar. Her mind transformed intolerable reality into something different, created explanations and structures where none existed, and generated perceptions that helped her maintain some form of psychological coherence in circumstances that should have destroyed her completely. Closely related to dissociation is a phenomenon called depersonalization derealization disorder, where individuals experience persistent or recurrent feelings of being detached from their own mental processes or body, or feeling that the external world is unreal, dreamlike, or distorted. This is distinct from full dissociative identity disorder, but shares similar underlying mechanisms. Depersonalization is the sense of being an outside observer of your own thoughts, feelings, or body. People describe it as watching themselves from outside their body, feeling like they're in a dream or movie, feeling that their body doesn't belong to them. Derealization is the sense that the external world is strange or unreal. Things look distorted. People seem mechanical or dead. The environment feels like a stage set rather than reality. Alessa's situation would almost certainly produce both. The trauma of being burned would create such dissociation from her body that continuing to identify with it would be intolerable. The pain signals her body was sending were so overwhelming that maintaining normal embodiment, the feeling of being in your body and identifying with it, would be impossible. Depersonalization would be a necessary defense mechanism, allowing her consciousness to distance itself from the flesh that was suffering. This might explain the splitting mechanically. If Alessa was already experiencing severe depersonalization, already feeling like she was observing her body from outside rather than inhabiting it, the next step would be to create an actual separate existence for that observing consciousness. Cheryl could represent the depersonalized aspect of her awareness, the part that watched her suffering from a distance and needed to be fully separate to survive. Derealization would explain how she perceives the world around her. If reality already feels dreamlike and unreal due to trauma, The boundary between what's actually happening and what she's perceiving becomes permeable. The hospital room might really be a hospital room, but her derealization makes it feel like a set in a horror play. And if her psychic ability allows her to impose her perceptions on reality, that feeling of unreality might actually become real. The hospital room transforms to match her derealized perception of it. Many people who experience depersonalization derealization describe it as a living nightmare where they're trapped in a world that doesn't feel real, but that they can't escape from. The distress comes not from hallucinations or delusions, but from the persistent feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with reality itself, that there's a barrier between them and genuine experience. This is exactly how characters describe Silent Hill. It feels wrong, feels like a nightmare they can't wake from, feels like reality has been replaced with something similar but fundamentally corrupted. If we understand the fog world as reality filtered through derealization, real places made to feel unreal and threatening, and the other world as a complete breakdown of the boundary between internal and external reality, we can map Alessa's progressive psychological deterioration. Initially, she experiences normal reality. After the bullying and parental abuse, she begins experiencing derealization. The world feels wrong, but is still recognizably the world. After the fire, the depersonalization and derealization become so severe that she fully dissociates, creating the split between Alessa and Cheryl, and transforming her perceptual distortions into actual environmental transformations through psychic power. This progression matches how dissociative symptoms typically develop. They start as momentary experiences during acute trauma, brief flashes where things don't feel real or where you feel disconnected from your body. With repeated trauma, these episodes become more frequent and prolonged. Eventually, for some individuals, the dissociative state becomes baseline, and normal reality becomes the exception rather than the rule. Alessa reached the point where her dissociated, derealized perception became her permanent state, and because of her abilities, that state became the permanent state of Silent Hill itself. Before the fire, Alessa exhibited behaviors consistent with social anxiety disorder and selective mutism. Game lore and supplementary materials describe her as extremely withdrawn, unable to speak to classmates, frozen during social interactions. This wasn't shyness, it was pathological anxiety that prevented normal social functioning. Social anxiety disorder involves intense fear of social situations where scrutiny is possible, fear of humiliation or embarrassment, and avoidance of social situations or endurance of them with intense distress. Children with social anxiety often struggle in school environments where peer interaction is constant and unavoidable. They might speak normally at home but become completely silent at school, might avoid eye contact, might experience panic symptoms when called on or when attention is focused on them. Selective mutism is a specific condition where children who are capable of speech become unable to speak in certain situations, typically social situations outside the home. It's strongly associated with social anxiety and represents an extreme anxiety response where the throat literally closes and speech becomes physiologically impossible, not just psychologically difficult. Children with selective mutism want to speak but cannot. The words won't come out despite their efforts. Alessa's withdrawal and inability to connect with peers suggest both conditions. Her psychic abilities likely made social anxiety worse because she could sense other children's thoughts about her. Imagine being able to perceive that your classmates find you weird, that they're thinking cruel thoughts, that they're planning to exclude or mock you. Most children with social anxiety worry about negative evaluation but don't know for certain what others think. Alessa knew. Her abilities gave her direct access to the social rejection she feared, creating a feedback loop where the anxiety was constantly validated by actual evidence of others' hostility. The bullying she experienced would exacerbate social anxiety to pathological levels. Bullying creates hypervigilance to social cues, constant monitoring of others' expressions and body language, persistent fear of humiliation. For a child who's already anxious and withdrawn, systematic bullying confirms their worst fears. They are different. They are worthy of ridicule. Social interaction leads to pain. The logical response is to withdraw further, to speak less, to make themselves as invisible as possible. Selective mutism, in Alessa's case, might have been partly protective. If speaking drew attention and attention led to bullying, remaining silent was a survival strategy. If her psychic abilities made her say things that frightened people or revealed knowledge she shouldn't have, silence prevented those slips. Mutism served as a shield, and like many anxiety-based behaviors, it persisted because it worked in the short term, even though it created longer-term problems. After the fire, any capacity for social interaction disappeared entirely. The catatonia and mutism became total. But there's continuity between pre-fire Alessa, who couldn't speak in social situations, and post-fire Alessa, who couldn't speak at all. The trauma amplified existing vulnerabilities, took patterns that were already developing, and pushed them to absolute extremes. To fully understand Alessa's psychological state, we need to examine what happens to a developing brain subjected to prolonged, extreme pain. Neuroscience research shows that chronic pain, especially pain experienced during childhood, fundamentally alters brain structure and function in ways that persist even after the pain ends. The pain system in humans involves multiple brain regions. The somatosensory cortex processes the location and intensity of pain. The insula processes the emotional quality of pain. The anterior cingulate cortex processes the suffering aspect of pain, and the prefrontal cortex modulates pain through attention and emotion regulation. In chronic pain, these regions become hyperactive, and the connections between them strengthen, creating a state where the brain is essentially stuck in pain mode, even when actual tissue damage decreases. For Alessa, with burns that were severe and treatment options in the 1960s and 70s that were primitive by modern standards, the pain would have been absolutely constant. No medication could have adequately controlled it. Her brain would have been flooded with pain signals every moment for 7 years. This creates neuroplastic changes. The pain pathways become so reinforced that they fire automatically, generating pain even without new injury. The brain literally learns to produce pain as its baseline state. Research on childhood trauma shows that it alters the development of crucial brain systems. The amygdala, which processes threat and fear, becomes enlarged and hyperactive in traumatized children. The hippocampus, which processes memory and context, often shrinks, making it harder to distinguish past from present. The prefrontal cortex, which manages executive function and emotion regulation, develops abnormally, leaving the person with poor impulse control and difficulty modulating emotional responses. Combine developmental trauma with chronic pain, and you get a brain that's simultaneously hypersensitive to threat, unable to regulate emotions, stuck in constant pain mode, and struggling to distinguish memory from current reality. This neurobiological state would make normal psychological functioning impossible. Every system that should help Alessa cope with her situation is damaged by the situation itself, creating a vicious cycle where trauma impairs coping. Impaired coping leads to more distress, and more distress reinforces the trauma, The psychic abilities in Alessa's case might actually have a neurobiological component. There's controversial research suggesting that people with certain types of temporal lobe abnormalities report increased intuition, empathy, or even experiences they describe as telepathic. While mainstream neuroscience doesn't support genuine telepathy, it's possible that Alessa's brain, developing abnormally due to trauma and pain, created unusual patterns of neural activity that manifested as heightened sensitivity to subtle social cues, which she interpreted as mind reading. Alternatively, the trauma might have damaged normal boundaries in her perception. There's a theory in consciousness studies that the brain normally filters out most sensory information to create a coherent experience of reality, and that when these filters malfunction, people experience sensory overwhelm or unusual perceptions. If Alessa's trauma damaged her perceptual filters, she might have been experiencing the world with unusual intensity or picking up on information most people filter out automatically, creating experiences that felt like supernatural abilities. From a neurobiological perspective, what Alessa needed was impossible to provide with 1970s medicine: aggressive pain management that actually worked, psychiatric medication to address the depression and psychosis, trauma-focused therapy designed for children, and complete removal from the environment and people who'd harmed her. Instead, she received minimal care, remained in pain, stayed in the same town where the trauma occurred with the same perpetrators nearby, and was given no psychological support. Her brain developed in the worst possible circumstances, creating neural patterns that would persist even if external circumstances improved. What we've examined so far, the complex PTSD, the dissociative identity formation, the attachment disorder, the depression with catatonic features, the prolonged grief for an unlived life, the pain-induced psychosis, the depersonalization and derealization, the social anxiety and selective mutism, and the neurobiological impact of chronic trauma and pain, represents only the beginning of understanding Alessa Gillespie's psychological state. We've cataloged the foundational disorders, the diagnoses that would appear in her medical chart if any clinician had bothered to evaluate her properly. But mental illness doesn't exist in discrete categories. It exists as overlapping, interacting systems where each disorder influences the others, where symptoms combine in ways that create entirely new presentations, where the whole is more catastrophic than the sum of its parts. Alessa doesn't have PTSD plus depression plus dissociation plus attachment disorder. She has a psychological system that's been shattered and reformed into something that no longer resembles normal human consciousness. In the next section, we'll examine the more complex manifestations of her trauma, how her disorders interact and amplify each other, how her supernatural abilities change the expression of her mental illness, how the town itself becomes an extension of her psychopathology, and how her influence continues even after her death. We'll explore the specific monsters she creates as manifestations of particular psychological processes, examine what the different versions of Silent Hill's otherworld reveal about her mental state, and diagnose the later manifestations of her consciousness that appear in subsequent games. Because Alessa's story doesn't end with Silent Hill 1, her trauma echoes through the entire franchise, her pain becoming the foundation that future horrors build upon. Understanding her psychology means understanding the psychological architecture of Silent Hill itself, recognizing that the town's power to manifest internal demons comes from one child's suffering being so profound it tore a hole in reality that never healed. But before we descend further into that analysis, let me ask, are you still comfortable? Have you adjusted your position, gotten some water, prepared yourself for the next level of this examination? Because what comes next goes darker. We're moving from diagnostic observation into the mechanics of how trauma this severe transforms not just an individual mind, but the fabric of reality around that mind. We're examining how a child's nightmare became a town's curse, how one girl's psychological hell became a shared destination for everyone guilty enough or damaged enough to find themselves drawn to Silent Hill. Because you're still here, now we can examine how mental illness becomes mythology, how a patient becomes a god, how suffering transcends the individual and becomes environmental. The diagnosis was just the beginning. Now we examine what happens when the diagnosed doesn't just have disorders but becomes them, when the boundary between person and pathology dissolves completely, when the victim transforms into the very thing that victimized her, a force that traps others in inescapable suffering with no hope of relief. The fire never stopped burning, it just spread. When Alessa's consciousness bleeds into Silent Hill's geography, transforming streets and buildings into manifestations of her internal landscape, she doesn't create random nightmare creatures. Every monster that crawls through the fog, every entity that shambles through rusted corridors, every creature that hunts through the other world represents a specific psychological process, a particular trauma, a distinct aspect of her fractured psyche made flesh. Understanding these monsters means understanding the mechanisms of her mental illness at a granular level that dialogue and exposition could never achieve. Let's start with the gray children, those small, knife-wielding figures in school uniforms who appear throughout the town. At first glance, they seem like obvious manifestations of the bullies who tormented Alessa at Midwich Elementary. That interpretation is partially correct, but incomplete. The gray children represent not just her tormentors, but her perception of childhood itself, corrupted by trauma into something inherently threatening. Child development research shows that peer relationships during elementary school years are crucial for forming social skills, developing self-concept, and learning to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. For most children, this period involves friendship formation, collaborative play, and gradual socialization. For Alessa, this period involved systematic exclusion, mockery, and physical harassment. Her classmates didn't just fail to befriend her, they actively constructed her as the class scapegoat, the target everyone could unite against to reinforce their own belonging. The gray children's appearance communicates specific psychological content. They're children, but they're colorless, drained of vitality and individuality. This reflects how bullying victims often perceive their tormentors as an undifferentiated mass of hostility rather than distinct individuals. The bullies blur together in memory because what mattered wasn't who they were as people, but what they represented collectively: rejection, danger, humiliation. The gray coloring also suggests emotional flatness, the numbing that occurs when you're subjected to repeated social trauma. Eventually, the attacks stop hurting in acute ways and become a dull, constant background pain, gray rather than sharp red. The knives they carry are small, child-sized weapons that shouldn't be particularly threatening, but become so through persistence and numbers. This mirrors the actual mechanism of childhood bullying. Individual incidents might seem minor to outside observers: name-calling, exclusion from games, whispers and giggles. But the cumulative effect of hundreds or thousands of these small cuts creates profound psychological damage. The gray children attack in groups, never alone, reflecting how bullies typically operate through collective action that diffuses individual responsibility. No single child has to feel fully culpable when everyone participates in the cruelty. Their presence, specifically in the school, emerging from classrooms and hallways, demonstrates how the physical environment becomes associated with trauma. Midwich Elementary should represent learning, growth, and childhood development. Instead, for Alessa, it represents daily torture, a building she was forced to enter knowing she would be harmed and humiliated. The school building itself becomes threatening through association, every classroom a site of potential attack, every hallway a gauntlet to survive. By manifesting the gray children within the school's otherworld version, Alessa's psyche is literalizing this association. The building and the bullies are inseparable. The location is contaminated by what happened there. The mumbler creatures, those crawling, childlike entities covered in what appears to be blood or burns, making inarticulate sounds, represent a different psychological process. These aren't her tormentors, but herself, or more specifically, her self-image as damaged, incomprehensible, and repulsive. The mumblers can't speak clearly, can't stand upright, can't function as proper humans. They're reduced to crawling and making sounds that suggest attempted communication without achieving it. This reflects Alessa's selective mutism and her feeling of being unable to express herself. The trauma she experienced was so overwhelming that normal language couldn't contain it. Children often lack the vocabulary to describe complex emotional pain, but Alessa's situation exceeded even adult linguistic capacity. How do you articulate what it feels like to burn alive while your mother watches? How do you explain the specific quality of being rejected by every peer simultaneously? The mumblers embody this inability to communicate, the frustration of having overwhelming internal experience with no way to make others understand it. The blood or burn covering on the mumblers connects to body image disturbance, a common feature in trauma survivors, especially those who've experienced disfigurement. After the fire, Alessa's body became something horrific to look at, something that caused revulsion in anyone who saw it. Research on burn survivors shows that disfigurement often creates profound shame and a sense of being fundamentally disgusting. The person internalizes others' reactions of horror or disgust and begins to perceive themselves as monstrous. The mumblers are this internalized self-perception made external. The image of herself as something damaged and repellent that should hide in darkness and can't function in normal society. The creeper insects, large cockroach-like creatures, tap into a different psychological vein. Insects, particularly cockroaches, appear in many people's nightmares and phobias because they represent contamination, infestation, things that crawl on you while you're helpless, invasion of your space by something you can't control. For Alessa, bedridden and unable to move, the fear of being crawled on by insects would be particularly acute. Unable to swat them away, unable to even flinch effectively, she would be completely vulnerable to any insect that entered her room. But the creepers also represent a psychological phenomenon called formication, the sensation of insects crawling on or under your skin. This symptom appears in various conditions including psychosis, drug withdrawal, and severe anxiety. For someone in a less state of extreme physical and psychological distress, tactile hallucinations would be common. The burning sensation of her wounds might create feelings of movement across her skin, feelings her traumatized mind interpreted as insects. The creepers literalize this psychotic symptom, making the hallucinated insects real and enlarging them to threatening size. There's also a symbolic dimension to insects as creatures associated with decay and corpses. Insects appear when things die, when flesh begins to rot. Alessa's body, though technically alive, was in a state of biological crisis that approached death. Maggots appear in necrotic tissue even while the patient lives. The creepers represent her perception of her own body as essentially dead, as carrion that insects should rightfully infest, as something already decaying despite the persistence of consciousness within it. The romper creatures, with their reptilian features, powerful builds, and aggressive behavior, represent a different psychological construct: externalized rage and the predatory adults who failed to protect her. These aren't child-sized like the gray children, or pathetic like the mumblers. These are powerful, dangerous entities that can't be dismissed or easily defeated. They embody the anger that Alessa couldn't express directly, the rage that had nowhere to go because the people who deserved it were untouchable. Children in abusive situations often can't safely express anger toward their abusers. The power differential is too extreme, the risk too high, so the anger turns inward, manifesting as depression and self-harm, or it gets stored, building pressure with no release valve. Alessa spent years unable to scream at her mother, unable to fight back against the cult, unable to retaliate against her bullies in any meaningful way. That unexpressed rage doesn't disappear. It accumulates, mutates, becomes toxic. The rompers are that rage given monstrous form, powerful enough to hurt people the way she was hurt, aggressive enough to pursue and attack without mercy. The reptilian features are particularly significant. Reptiles are often perceived as cold-blooded in both literal and metaphorical senses, creatures without mammalian warmth, without the capacity for affection or empathy. By making her rage monsters reptilian, Alessa's psyche is communicating something about the nature of the anger she carries. It's cold, it's alien to her normal personality. It's something that operates without the warmth of human feeling. This reflects how trauma can create emotional states that feel foreign to the person experiencing them. Anger so intense it doesn't feel like it belongs to you, but rather like something possessing you. The air screamers, flying creatures that dive bomb from above, represent a specific trauma response. Hypervigilance to threats from unexpected angles. PTSD creates a state of constant alertness where the person scans their environment obsessively for potential dangers. But the trauma has taught them that danger doesn't announce itself, doesn't approach from predictable directions. It comes suddenly, from above, from behind, from places you weren't watching. The air screamers literalize this hypervigilant scanning behavior by being threats that actually do come from the one direction, above, that people typically don't monitor. Their screaming serves a dual purpose. On one level, it's a warning system, alerting to their presence before they attack. But screaming also represents the terror vocalization that Alessa herself might have produced during her burning, the sounds of agony that escaped when pain exceeded the capacity to contain it. By making monsters that scream, she's projecting her own screaming outward, making the environment echo with the sounds of suffering that emerged from her. The twin feeler creature, encountered in specific nightmare sequences, is particularly revealing from a psychological standpoint. This large insectoid entity, with a distinctly phallic appearance, represents sexual anxiety and confusion, themes that might seem unexpected for a 7-year-old, but that appear in children who've been exposed to sexual content inappropriately or who've experienced sexual abuse. While the games don't explicitly state that Alessa experienced sexual abuse, cult environments frequently involve sexual exploitation of children, and the cult's obsession with her body as a vessel for birth carries uncomfortable sexual implications. The creature's design, penetrating through surfaces, its invasive movement pattern, The way it must be confronted in confined spaces evokes sexual violation. For a child raised in a cult that reduced her to her reproductive capacity, that viewed her body primarily as a container for God, sexual anxieties would develop even without direct sexual abuse. The violation of being told your body doesn't belong to you, that it exists to serve others' purposes, that its primary value is what it can produce. This is a form of psychological sexual violation that creates shame and confusion about bodily autonomy. The twin feelers' placement in nightmare sequences rather than the main gameplay also suggests this represents trauma that's even more deeply buried than the rest, material that only surfaces in the most extreme psychological states. Sexual trauma in children is often repressed more completely than other trauma types because the child lacks the framework to understand it and because the shame is so overwhelming. By placing this creature in nightmare sequences, the game suggests this is Alessa's deepest, most hidden wound, something that emerges only when all other defenses have failed. The incubus and incubi creatures that appear in later games and media represent the culmination of Alessa's trauma, manifesting as outright demonic imagery. The incubus in mythology is a demon that sexually assaults sleeping victims, a perfect metaphor for trauma that attacks you when you're most vulnerable and helpless. For Alessa, trapped in a hospital bed, unable to defend herself, every experience was an experience of being attacked while helpless. The incubus literalizes this, a monstrous entity that embodies violation of the defenseless. But the incubus also represents the god that the cult wanted her to birth, the entity whose gestation caused all her suffering. By manifesting the god as monstrous rather than divine, Alessa's psychology is rejecting the cult's narrative. They told her she was carrying something holy, something worthy of any sacrifice. Her mind reframes it as demonic, as violation, as something that should never have been placed inside her. This reframing is psychologically healthy in one sense. It's her mind accurately identifying that what was done to her was wrong, was monstrous, was not the sacred act Dahlia claimed. But it also traps her in ongoing relationship with the trauma because she can't fully separate from it. She has to keep fighting it, keep preventing its birth, keep maintaining vigilance against its emergence. While the monsters are the most obvious manifestations of Alessa's psychology, the environments themselves communicate equally important diagnostic information. The other world doesn't just look scary, it's structured according to, say, psychological principles that reveal how trauma rewires cognitive and emotional processing. The rust that coats every surface in otherworld sequences has been discussed extensively in Silent Hill analysis, but it's worth examining from a clinical perspective on oxidation as a metaphor for psychological decay. Rust occurs when iron is exposed to oxygen and moisture over time, a process that weakens the metal's structure and eventually causes complete breakdown. This is a perfect metaphor for what trauma does to psychological structures. When children develop in safe environments, they build psychological resilience, coping mechanisms, emotional regulation strategies, cognitive frameworks for understanding the world. These structures are like the protective coating on metal that prevents oxidation. Trauma strips away these protective layers, exposing the raw psyche to corrosive elements. With repeated trauma, the psychological structures begin to break down, weakening until they can no longer support the person's functioning. The rust in Silent Hill represents this progressive deterioration, showing environments where all protective structures have failed and decay has set in completely. The specific quality of the rust is important. It's not just orange-brown discoloration, it's thick, dripping, almost organic in appearance. This suggests rust that's still actively spreading, decay that's ongoing rather than complete. Psychologically, this reflects how trauma isn't a single event, but a continuing process. Even after the fire stopped, even after the acute abuse ended, Alessa's psychological deterioration continued because the damage created conditions for further damage. Untreated trauma doesn't stabilize. It spreads, contaminates other areas of functioning, creates new problems that create new trauma. The chain link fencing that appears throughout the other world serves multiple symbolic functions. Most obviously, it represents barriers and restrictions. Alessa trapped in her hospital bed, unable to move or escape. But chain link has specific properties that make it particularly meaningful. It's transparent, you can see through it, but not pass through it. This represents the psychological experience of being able to perceive freedom, normalcy, safety, but being unable to access them. Alessa could imagine being a normal child, could see other children living normal lives, but couldn't reach that reality herself. The chain link made her confinement visible rather than hidden, forced her to see what she couldn't have. Chain link is also industrial, cheap, utilitarian, the kind of barrier used in prisons, construction sites, and abandoned lots. It's not the ornamental fence of a home or the natural barrier of a hedge. It's purely functional restriction, denying access without aesthetic consideration. This reflects how Alessa's confinement wasn't about her well-being, but about the cult's needs. She was imprisoned functionally, as a necessary means to an end, without anyone caring about the psychological impact of her captivity. The grid pattern of chain link creates visual fragmentation, breaking the view into hundreds of small, diamond-shaped windows. Looking through chain link for extended periods creates eye strain and distortion of perspective. This mirrors cognitive fragmentation, the way trauma breaks unified consciousness into fragmented perceptions and memories. Alessa's experience of reality would be fractured, broken into pieces that don't cohere into a stable whole, and the chain link visually represents this fragmentation. The blood that seeps through walls, floors, and ceilings in otherworld sequences operates on multiple psychological registers. Most directly, it represents the violence done to Alessa's body, the fire, the burns, the ongoing tissue damage. Blood is the body's distress signal made visible, and chronic bleeding suggests wounds that never heal. For 7 years, Alessa's body was essentially an open wound. The blood flowing through otherworld environments literalizes this, making the buildings bleed the way her body bled, creating architectural wounds that parallel somatic wounds. But blood in these contexts also represents guilt and moral contamination. The phrase blood on your hands captures how participation in violence creates lasting psychological staining. The cult members who participated in Alessa's burning, the townspeople who knew and did nothing, the school officials who failed to intervene in her bullying, all of them carry responsibility for what happened to her. The blood seeping through Silent Hill's buildings represents their collective guilt, made environmental, suggesting that the entire town is contaminated by complicity in her suffering. There's also a menstrual dimension to blood symbolism that becomes relevant given the cult's obsession with Alessa's reproductive capacity. Menstruation represents fertility and the capacity for pregnancy, but for young girls who haven't started menstruating yet, it can represent anxious anticipation of bodily changes they don't fully understand. The cult was waiting for Alessa to mature enough to birth the god, waiting for her body to become capable of reproduction. The excessive blood in the other world might represent anxiety about this impending bodily change, fear about what her maturing body would be used for, horror at the thought of pregnancy and birth forced upon her. The grated metal floors that appear in industrial sections of the other world create specific sensory experiences. You can see through them to depths below. They create loud clanging sounds when walked on. They have gaps that could trap a foot or swallow a dropped object. These properties create physical anxiety about falling, about being heard, about losing things to the depths. For Alessa, these anxieties would be profound, metaphorical falling, falling into deeper trauma, falling into madness, falling into the cult's complete control, was a constant threat. Being heard, having her suffering noticed, having someone respond to her screaming, was both a desperate hope and a terrifying prospect, because the people who might hear were often the ones causing harm. The industrial machinery that appears in otherworld basements and hidden areas represents dehumanization and mechanization of suffering. Factories and industrial equipment reduce humans to labor units, to bodies that serve the machine's function. The cult viewed Alessa similarly, as a mechanism for producing a god, a biological machine whose suffering was an acceptable operational cost. The industrial imagery literalizes this dehumanization, placing Alessa's trauma in environments that visually communicate her reduction from person to tool. The hospital sections deserve particular attention because medical environments carry specific psychological associations for trauma survivors. Hospitals should represent healing and care, but for people who've suffered medical trauma or inadequate medical treatment, hospitals become sites of additional violation. Alessa spent 7 years in a hospital that couldn't or wouldn't adequately treat her pain, where doctors presumably examined her wounds regularly without being able to offer meaningful relief, where the environment was sterile and cold and focused on clinical observation rather than comfort. The Otherworld Hospital in Silent Hill transforms medical equipment into torture devices, examination tables into restraint platforms, treatment rooms into execution chambers. This reflects Alessa's experience of medicine as torture, procedures done to her body without her consent, painful examinations, treatments that perhaps caused as much pain as they alleviated. For burn victims, treatment often involves debridement, removal of dead tissue, which is agonizing even with pain medication. Dressing changes expose nerve endings to air, causing pain that many survivors describe as worse than the initial burn. By transforming the hospital into a grotesque parody of medical care, Alessa's psychology is accurately representing her experience. The doctors weren't healing her, they were keeping her alive to suffer longer. The equipment wasn't treatment, it was the infrastructure of her prolonged torture, the clinical detachment of medical professionals, necessary for them to function but experienced as coldness by patients, became actual coldness, actual absence of humanity, actual reduction of her to a clinical case rather than a suffering child. The holes that appear in walls and floors throughout the otherworld function as transitions between areas, but also carry symbolic weight. Holes represent voids, absences, incompleteness. Psychologically, they can represent dissociative gaps, places where memory or identity should be but isn't. Alessa's consciousness is full of these gaps. The part of herself she split off and sent away, the memories too traumatic to fully recall, the aspects of normal development she never got to experience. The holes in the otherworld's architecture literalize these psychological gaps, creating a space that's incomplete, that has voids where substance should be. The holes also create navigation challenges that require descent into darkness or squeezing through tight spaces. This mirrors the psychological work required to access traumatic material. You have to descend into dark psychological places, have to squeeze through constricted spaces where panic threatens, Have to trust that you'll emerge on the other side rather than getting stuck in the darkness. Therapy for severe trauma often feels like this: going into holes in your psyche that you'd rather avoid, finding what's hidden in the darkness, and hoping you can climb back out afterward. The repetitive architecture, identical hallways that loop back on themselves, rooms that repeat with slight variations, spaces that seem to reconfigure when you're not looking, represents the obsessive, compulsive, and perseverative thinking that trauma creates. PTSD involves intrusive thoughts that repeat endlessly, the same traumatic memories cycling through consciousness despite efforts to stop them. The environment's repetitiveness literalizes this mental experience, trapping the visitor in loops that echo the trauma victim's inability to escape their own thoughts. There's also a maze quality to much of the other world, spaces that deliberately confuse and disorient. This reflects cognitive confusion, the way trauma disrupts clear thinking and decision making. When you're in a trauma state, simple decisions become overwhelming, navigation becomes difficult, and you feel lost even in familiar environments. The other world's maze-like properties force visitors to experience this confusion externally, making the environment as disorienting as traumatized thinking. One of the most tragic aspects of Alessa's case is that the trauma occurred during critical developmental periods, arresting her psychological growth at age 7 while her consciousness continued for years beyond. Developmental psychology shows that children progress through predictable stages, each building on the previous one, and that trauma can disrupt this progression, creating adults who remain psychologically stuck at the age they were traumatized. Alessa was 7 when the fire occurred. 7 is what Piaget called the concrete, operational stage of cognitive development. Children can think logically about concrete objects and events, but struggle with abstract thinking. They're developing moral reasoning, beginning to understand that rules aren't arbitrary but serve purposes, starting to see other people's perspectives. They're forming their sense of identity separate from their parents, developing peer relationships that will shape their social functioning for life. All of this stopped for Alessa. Trapped in a hospital bed, she couldn't continue normal development. She couldn't practice social skills, couldn't experiment with independence, couldn't gradually build the cognitive complexity that adolescence requires. Her consciousness remained active, accumulating experiences and awareness, but without the normal developmental inputs. This creates a peculiar psychological profile, a being with adult awareness and a child's emotional resources, enormous power and profound helplessness, sophisticated strategic thinking, and age 7 emotional regulation. This developmental arrest is visible in how she manifests her trauma. The monsters are largely child logic monsters, direct, literal representations rather than the complex symbolism an adult might create. The other world's punishments are concrete and physical rather than psychological or existential. Her solution to the problem of the cult, splitting herself in half, is creative but reflects child-level problem solving, addressing the immediate issue without considering long-term implications. There's a poignancy to developmental arrest in trauma victims because they're frozen at the moment of greatest vulnerability. 7-year-old Alessa needed protection, nurturing, safety. Instead, she got betrayal and torture, and she never got the chance to develop beyond that moment of need. Every year she spent trapped was a year she should have been learning, growing, progressing through normal stages. Instead, she remained perpetually 7 in the ways that mattered most, needing things that would never be provided, waiting for developmental milestones she would never reach. Psychological research Unlearned helplessness provides crucial context for understanding Alessa's mental state. In studies conducted by Martin Seligman, animals subjected to inescapable electric shocks eventually stopped trying to escape, even when escape became possible. They had learned that their actions had no effect on their suffering, and this learning generalized to create a state of passive acceptance of pain, even in new situations where they could escape. Alessa's situation perfectly exemplifies learned helplessness. She couldn't escape the bullying. Changing schools wasn't an option. Fighting back would have made it worse. Telling adults resulted in no intervention. She couldn't escape her mother. Children can't simply leave their parents. And Dahlia controlled every aspect of her life. She couldn't escape the fire once it started. She was physically overpowered by adults and immobilized. She couldn't escape the hospital bed afterward. Her burns left her unable to move, and the cult ensured she remained hospitalized. Every avenue of escape was blocked. Every attempt to change her circumstances failed. Over time, this teaches a profound lesson. Effort is futile. Resistance is pointless. Acceptance is the only option. This creates a specific pattern of thinking called external locus of control, where the person believes events are controlled by outside forces rather than by their own actions. For Alessa, this was accurate. She genuinely had no control over what happened to her. But the psychological consequence is generalized helplessness that persists even when some degree of agency becomes possible. The learned helplessness framework helps explain why Alessa doesn't simply escape when she splits her soul. She has psychic power that could presumably accomplish many things, yet she remains trapped in her suffering. The psychological conditioning of helplessness is so profound that even with supernatural abilities, she can't conceptualize actually freeing herself. The best she can imagine is splitting herself so part of her escapes while part remains to suffer, maintaining the fundamental pattern that she must suffer even when alternatives theoretically exist. This also explains the passivity in her response to the cult. Rather than using her abilities to destroy the cult members, to kill Dahlia, to burn down the hospital, she creates an otherworld that traps everyone in suffering similar to her own. It's not active resistance, but a generalized distribution of pain, making others feel what she feels rather than eliminating the source of her pain. This reflects the cognitive pattern of learned helplessness. You can't imagine actually solving the problem, so you adjust to the problem's continued existence and find ways to cope with it rather than eliminate it. Breaking learned helplessness requires experiencing success and changing outcomes, gradually rebuilding the belief that actions matter. For Alessa, this never happens. She remains trapped in helplessness until she dies, never experiencing the agency and effectiveness that could rebuild her sense of control. Her tragedy isn't just that terrible things happened to her, but that she was never given the chance to learn that she could affect her circumstances, that effort could produce results, that she had power over her own life. Attachment theorist John Bowlby described how children grieve for parents differently than adults do, and how parental loss creates distinct psychological challenges. But Alessa's case represents a more complex phenomenon: grief for the parent who never existed, for the mother Dahlia should have been, but never was. Children have an intuitive expectation of what mothers should be: protective, nurturing, attuned to their needs, willing to sacrifice for their well-being. These expectations aren't learned but appear to be biologically prepared, part of the attachment system that evolved to keep helpless infants alive. When mothers fail to meet these expectations, when they're neglectful or abusive or exploitative, children experience a particular kind of grief that's more complicated than bereavement. Alessa's mother was alive, present, and actively engaged in her life, but as an abuser rather than a nurturer. This creates what's called ambiguous loss, loss that occurs without clear endings or deaths. Dahlia, the mother figure, died for Alessa when Dahlia chose the cult over her daughter. But Dahlia, the person, remained, creating ongoing confusion about who this woman was and what relationship Alessa had with her. The grief includes mourning for the mother she needed, the mother who existed in her imagination and hopes, but never in reality. Young Alessa would have desperately wanted a mother who protected her from bullies, who made her feel safe, who chose her over everything else. That mother never existed, and grieving for her requires accepting that the person who should have been your primary attachment figure fundamentally failed you. This grief often persists throughout life because there's no closure. You can't mourn the relationship properly because the person is still alive, still present, still failing you in new ways. There's also complicated grief about Alessa's own potential motherhood. The cult wanted her to birth a god, to become a mother herself through violation and force. For a 7-year-old, the concept of motherhood is abstract, something that belongs to the distant future. Having it forced into immediate relevance creates psychological havoc. She couldn't conceptualize herself as a mother because she was still a child, but the cult's plans meant she had to think about pregnancy and birth in ways no child should have to consider. This forced contemplation of motherhood, while simultaneously experiencing catastrophic maternal failure, creates a psychological knot with no clear resolution. Motherhood becomes associated with violation and suffering. The maternal role becomes something horrible rather than something to aspire to, and Alessa herself becomes caught between being a daughter who desperately needs mothering and being forced into a maternal role she's completely unprepared for. The game's resolution, where Alessa Cheryl produces a reborn infant version of herself, can be read as an attempt to give herself the mother she needed by becoming that mother. The baby represents a fresh start, a version of herself that might receive proper care. But it's also profoundly sad because Alessa never got to be a child herself, never got the nurturing she needed, and now she's dying while creating a baby that someone else will raise. She's giving her reborn self to Harry, hoping he'll be the parent she never had, while she remains trapped in the fundamental experience of maternal abandonment. One of the most psychologically complex aspects of Alessa's situation is that she exists in a state where death would be released, but death is impossible. This creates a unique form of suffering that combines suicidal ideation with the absolute prevention of suicide completion, a state that has no equivalent in normal human experience, but that appears in certain cases of severe medical incapacitation. Suicidal ideation exists on a spectrum from passive death wishes, I wish I would die in my sleep, to active planning and attempts. For someone in a less state of constant agony, suicidal ideation would be not just present but entirely rational. When pain is relentless and relief is impossible, death becomes the only logical solution. This isn't mental illness creating distorted thinking. It's accurate assessment of an intolerable situation. But Alessa can't act on suicidal ideation because she's completely immobilized. She can't swallow pills, can't access weapons, can't even move enough to fall from the hospital bed. Her helplessness extends to helplessness about ending her own suffering. This creates a particular kind of torture, wanting death desperately while being prevented from achieving it by the same bodily damage that makes death desirable. There's also the supernatural component. Dahlia and the cult are using power to keep Alessa alive despite injuries that should be fatal. This is medical technology pushed to horrific ends, keeping someone alive who should be allowed to die. In modern medical ethics, this situation appears in debates about life support and the right to die. When someone is kept alive by technology, despite no quality of life and no hope of recovery, we recognize this as potentially cruel rather than compassionate. Alessa's case is the extreme version, active prevention of natural death in order to prolong suffering for someone else's benefit. This creates a psychological state that might be called trapped dying. The person is simultaneously living and dying, maintained in a liminal state between the two. The Buddhist concept of hungry ghosts captures something of this. Beings who can neither live satisfactorily nor die completely, trapped in a state of perpetual unfulfilled need. Alessa exists in this state for 7 years, consciousness persisting in a body that should be dead, unable to either fully live or completely die. The psychological defense against this situation appears to be dissociation so profound it creates the other world. If you can't physically escape the bed, you escape psychologically by projecting your consciousness outward until the bed becomes just one small point in a vast landscape of your own creation. The other world is Alessa's suicide attempt, an attempt to exit her actual circumstances by creating alternative circumstances, by making her internal state external so she can exist somewhere other than her burning body. But this escape remains incomplete. She's simultaneously in the bed suffering and in the town creating nightmares, simultaneously trapped and omnipresent, simultaneously helpless and powerful. This paradox reflects the fundamental paradox of dissociation. It allows you to survive circumstances that should destroy you, but survival achieved through dissociation isn't the same as being alive. You're maintained in existence, but not in any state that feels like living. The game's endings address this paradox differently. The good ending allows her to finally die, giving Harry the reborn baby that represents her hope while releasing her from the prolonged dying she's experienced. This represents successful completion of the suicide she's been attempting for years. Not suicide as pathology, but suicide as rational choice to end meaningless suffering. The bad ending traps her in continued existence, forcing her to birth the god and presumably continue suffering. This represents the worst outcome. The suicide attempt fails, the escape is prevented, and the suffering continues indefinitely. We've discussed psychotic symptoms throughout this analysis, but it's worth addressing directly the question of what's real in Alessa's experience, and what might be psychotic distortion of reality. The games present the supernatural elements as genuinely real. Psychic powers exist. The other world is actual. The monsters physically threaten people. But from a clinical perspective, we should consider whether Alessa is experiencing psychotic symptoms that she and others interpret as supernatural. Psychosis, in its most fundamental form, is loss of contact with consensus reality. The person experiencing psychosis perceives, believes, or thinks things that don't align with what most people perceive, believe, or think. Hallucinations create sensory experiences without external stimuli. Delusions create fixed false beliefs that resist contrary evidence. Thought disorder creates disorganized thinking that others can't follow. Alessa's psychic abilities could represent various forms of psychosis. Her belief that she can read minds might be a delusion, an unshakable conviction that she has abilities she doesn't actually possess. Her perception of the other world might be a complex hallucination, a sensory experience generated by her traumatized brain rather than an actual alternate dimension. Her creation of monsters might be delusional interpretation of ordinary events, seeing people as monsters rather than actually transforming them. The shared nature of the experiences. Other people perceive the other world too, encounter the monsters, navigate the nightmare landscape, complicates this interpretation. If Alessa were simply psychotic, how would others share her hallucinations? Several possibilities exist within psychiatric frameworks. First, shared psychotic disorder, also called folie à deux or induced delusional disorder. This occurs when a delusion or psychotic system transfers from one person to others in close association. Alessa's conviction that Silent Hill is a nightmare could be so powerful that others begin experiencing it similarly, not through psychic transmission, but through psychological contagion. Second, environmental factors might create similar psychotic responses in multiple people. If Silent Hill has toxic environmental elements, mold producing mycotoxins, pollutants affecting neurological function, infrasound creating psychological distress, multiple people might develop psychotic symptoms independently but with similar content because they're responding to the same environmental triggers. Third, trauma survivors visiting Silent Hill might experience their own psychotic breaks triggered by the town's atmosphere and their personal guilt or trauma, with the overlaps between different people's experiences being coincidental or influenced by cultural factors that shape hallucination content. Fourth, and most relevant to Alessa's case, severe psychosis can create what appears to be shared experience through the psychotic person's absolute conviction, influencing how others interpret ambiguous stimuli. If Alessa believes monsters are present with utter certainty, visitors to Silent Hill might interpret shadows, sounds, and movement in ways that confirm her belief, creating an apparent shared experience that's actually separate interpretations converging. The counterargument is that the games demonstrate physical effects. Monsters leave corpses, otherworld damage persists, events have consequences that continue after people leave Silent Hill. This suggests the phenomena are genuinely real rather than purely psychotic. But we should note that psychotic individuals can injure themselves or others during psychotic episodes, creating real physical consequences from psychotic perceptions. If Alessa or others attack what they perceive as monsters but are actually attacking people or themselves, the injuries are real even though the perceived threat isn't. From a treatment perspective, the question of whether Alessa's experiences are genuinely supernatural or psychotic matters tremendously. If they're supernatural, psychiatric treatment is irrelevant. You don't treat accurate perception of supernatural phenomena with antipsychotics, but if they're psychotic, proper medication and therapy might reduce her suffering significantly. The tragedy is that she receives no psychiatric care either way, so the question remains academic. What's clinically certain is that Alessa exhibits many symptoms consistent with psychotic disorders, hallucinations or experiences indistinguishable from hallucinations, beliefs that deviate dramatically from consensus reality, disorganized thinking evidenced by the illogical architecture of the other world, and social withdrawal consistent with psychotic disorders. Whether these symptoms represent psychotic illness or accurate perception of supernatural phenomena, they indicate profound disturbance in her psychological functioning. Let's address what 7 years of constant severe pain does to a developing brain, with the blunt acknowledgement that we're discussing something beyond normal medical experience. No documented case exists of someone surviving burns this severe for this long, especially not a child, but we can extrapolate from research on chronic pain, burn survivors, and childhood trauma to understand the neurobiological catastrophe Alessa experienced. Chronic pain fundamentally rewires the nervous system through a process called central sensitization. Initially, pain is a protective signal. Nerve endings detect tissue damage and send warning signals to the brain. But with prolonged pain, the nervous system becomes hyper-responsive, amplifying pain signals, generating pain from stimuli that shouldn't hurt, and eventually producing pain without any physical stimulus at all. The pain system becomes the problem rather than the warning of a problem. In central sensitization, neurons in the spinal cord and brain that process pain become more excitable. They fire more easily, respond to weaker stimuli, and recruit additional neurons into pain processing. The brain literally grows more pain circuitry, dedicating more neural real estate to processing pain until pain becomes the dominant sensory experience. For Alessa, after 7 years of constant severe pain, her brain would have restructured around pain processing to the point where pain was no longer a sensation among others, but the fundamental texture of consciousness itself. Research on burn survivors shows that burn pain is uniquely severe. Burns destroy nerve endings, but in doing so, they create nerve pain, neuropathic pain that persists long after the tissue damage. The surviving nerve endings become hypersensitive. Scar tissue creates ongoing discomfort, and burn survivors often experience what's called phantom burn sensation, the feeling of burning even when no burns are present, a neurological memory of the original injury that the brain continues to generate. For a developing child's brain, chronic pain has additional catastrophic effects. Brain development during childhood by the cult, this representation of herself. This is vicarious hope, satisfaction at creating possibility, even though you won't experience the benefit yourself. Her final act, trusting Harry with her reborn self, demonstrates remarkable psychological health, despite everything suggesting she should trust no adult ever again. Every adult in her life failed or harmed her, yet she gives the baby to Harry, implicitly trusting him to provide the parenting she never received. This suggests that despite the trauma, some core part of her retained the ability to distinguish between trustworthy and untrustworthy people, that the damage didn't completely destroy her judgment. The relief other characters might feel at her death, if they understood the fullness of her suffering, would be appropriate rather than callous. When someone has suffered beyond all bounds of tolerability, death is a gift. Mourning in this context is complicated. Sad that circumstances were so terrible that death was the best option, but grateful that the suffering finally ended. Alessa's death doesn't end her psychological influence on Silent Hill. The town itself seems to retain an imprint of her consciousness, continuing to manifest psychological projection for other damaged individuals who enter it. Understanding this requires examining how severe trauma can create lasting environmental effects beyond the individual's lifespan. The concept of place memory or psychic imprinting appears in various cultural and religious traditions. The idea that extreme emotions or events can somehow be absorbed by locations, creating hauntings or persistent presences. From a psychological perspective, we might understand this as traumatized individuals recognizing resonances with their own pain in locations where others suffered similarly. But Silent Hill suggests something more, that Alessa's psychic abilities created actual lasting changes to the town's metaphysical properties. She tore open a boundary between internal and external reality that never fully closed, leaving Silent Hill permanently capable of manifesting psychological content as physical phenomena. Her trauma became the template that the town uses to interact with subsequent visitors. This represents trauma's persistence across time and people. Individual, the one that encompasses all the others. Alessa Gillespie was a child whose suffering exceeded the human capacity to endure, and she endured anyway, and it destroyed